Hey guys, today I'll be taking you through our group's PowerPoint regarding the legality of compensating student athletes, and specifically collegiate student athletes, and some of the legal and ethical implications that are actually tied in with that as well. So let's go ahead and just jump right on into our presentation. So, what exactly is the current issue that we're looking at in this situation? So, recently, California has actually become the most recent proponent of paying student athletes for their name and their likeness, which is something that the NCAA really has been frowning upon since it was created. Governor Gavin Newsom recently signed a law into effect that states that student athletes can now accept endorsement deals and promote different products and or companies. This law actually doesn't go into effect until January 1st of 2023, but this is obviously something that's a really big deal in the community of collegiate athletics. A stipulation of this law is that it can't be applied to junior college players, nor can players accept endorsements or promote companies that the school already has a contract with. So, for example, Houston Baptist has a contract with Under Armour for all of its sports. So, if in this case, if a student athlete was to accept an endorsement deal with, say, Adidas, that would be against the legislations, and they would not be able to do that. So the NCAA, has recently stated that the move by the governor is actually unconstitutional, and they're looking at what steps it's going to take next, and they're considering that currently. I find it very interesting to note that several schools, such as USC and Stanford, both obviously California schools, have opposed the governor's passing of the bill in fear of possible fines and a possible expulsion from the NCAA, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So now that we have some background on the current issue at hand, we can now understand that this issue has actually been going on for quite some time now, which is why the title of this slide is The Never-Ending Issue, because it seems to be recurring a lot in sports today, especially within collegiate sports. So something that we have to look at is that student athletes are under constant scrutiny, and they've worked for quite some time now to actually be fairly compensated for their efforts, even though student athletes get scholarships and are given money to pay for their education. They still feel like they should be compensated more for the efforts that they are giving. So, for the longest time, the NCAA has actually really strongly opposed any form of an extra benefit to a student athlete, but recently it has allowed student athletes to be paid in specific situations. So some examples that we have found and listed here for you is that the NCAA actually allows Olympic athletes to compete for their countries and has allowed this since 2001, but they can pocket any money that they make from winning a bronze, silver, or gold medal. The sport of tennis can actually receive $10,000 per year in prize money before and during college. College football bowl gifts, which most teams get for making it to a bowl game, can be valued at about $550. So this can be anything from watches, gift cards, electronics, all those different things. They can be valued up to that much money. And then recently, student assistant funds have been created for insurance policies that actually protect professional futures of their athletes. So although the NCAA has allowed these certain exceptions, the student athletes are still not allowed to make money off their name and likeness, as it most directly affects the NCAA's definition of amateurism, which we will look at here soon. So how exactly does all of this apply to sport law? And how can it apply to what we've been learning in this class so far? So the legality of this case actually comes into play when we look at how the passing of this law in California is going to affect the legislation that the NCAA has already put out. So member schools are actually bound by the NCAA's rules and regulations and are obligated to administer their athletic programs in accordance with NCAA rules, which comes directly from our textbook. So the passing of this law by Governor Newsom is actually a direct violation of this law and would potentially violate the amateur status of a student athlete if they so choose to partake in this ruling that the governor has now created. So the NCAA has made it clear that they have a right to ban anyone from the institution that does not comply with their rules and regulations. And that's something that USC and Stanford were clearly worried about when they opposed the law that was most recently created. So now we're going to take a look at how exactly the NCAA defines amateurism, because this is a pretty important concept to understand why this is such a big deal to not let athletes make money off their name and likeness. So as we discussed, we're going to talk about the NCAA defining amateurism. So the NCAA states that you are not eligible to participate if you have, for any of these listed reasons, or if you've committed any of these things in this list. If you've taken pay or promise of pay for competing in sport, if you've agreed orally or in writing to participate professionally in your sport, if you've played on any professional team that has been defined by the NCAA in that sport, if you've used your athletic skills to pay in any form or for pay in any form in that sport, if you've accepted benefits from an agent, and then I directly quoted this one from the NCAA handbook because it directly applies to the situation that we're looking at right now. If a student, after you've become a student athlete, you accept any pay for promoting a commercial product or service, or allow your name or picture to be used for promoting a commercial product or service. So this is again directly going against what the governor of California has passed. So the next thing that we're going to examine is one more piece of legislation that kind of takes into effect everything that we've kind of been learning about the legality of this issue. So that act that I recently described as the Sherman Antitrust Act, and a lot of the cases that are brought to court actually deal with this case. So many of the plaintiffs bring their case to court under the pretense that the NCAA has violated this Sherman Antitrust Act, which was created in 1980. The act was created in an attempt to essentially prevent giant monopolies from taking over the country. And the argument in court is typically that the NCAA has become a monopoly within sport, directly violating this act. So they argue essentially that their right to trade is being impeded by the NCAA's no draft, no agent, and limited compensation rules. So, as stated earlier, many of the court cases that are brought into judges or various juries, or whatever the case may be, athletes feel like they are not being fairly compensated, or that the NCAA's restrictions on them is monopolistic in a sense. So now we're actually going to look at just how big the NCAA has grown over the last few years, and how it can be argued that it can truly be considered a monopoly. So the NCAA recently, I'm not sure how many years ago, but it eclipsed the $1 billion mark in profits for the first time in history. And that year it actually totaled $1.06 billion in revenue. The NCAA men's basketball tournament profited the NCAA $1.15 billion in TV ads alone. That doesn't even make up ticket sales. The NCAA made $129.3 million off of those ticket sales that we have been talking about, and they also made $60 million in marketing rights. So we did some research and we said, okay, well, where does all of this money go if they're eclipsing the $1 billion mark in profits? So $560.3 million goes back to its 1,100 member institutions, which would include everyone involved in the NCAA. $160.5 million went into the performance funds to reward teams for advancing in the NCAA tournament, making it to the Final Four, etc. $209 million was used in a settlement for illegally capped scholarships. So this has been kind of in the news as of recently, and it's also going to be brought up in a case that we're talking about a little bit later. And then $70 million was used for new concussion testing protocols. So the rest of it, where does the rest of it go? The rest of it, no one really knows. It definitely doesn't go back to the student athletes in any way, shape, or form. That is pretty much all that we know about the situation. So now that we've established several definitions by the NCAA and various legislations within our government today, I think it's very important to start looking at what other people are saying about the NCAA today. So many people believe that the NCAA is being way too harsh and not allowing their student athletes to be compensated more for what they're doing. So superstars like LeBron James have recently been in the news speaking out about this. He currently plays for the Los Angeles Lakers, but LeBron absolutely thinks that the NCAA is putting too much restraint on his student athletes. And in a recent article, I put a quote in here because I thought it was very telling of what he truly believes about the situation. And he was quoted saying that he would not have benefited in any way, shape, or form for playing collegiate basketball. He recently stated that for sure I would have been one of those kids if I would have went off to Ohio State or if I would have went off to any one of those big time colleges where pretty much that 23 jersey would have got sold all over the place without my name on the back, but everybody would have known the likeness. My body would have been on the NCAA basketball game 2004. The Shot Sign Center would have been sold out every single night if I was there. So essentially what LeBron was saying was that his choice to go from high school into the pros was in a large part because of the NCAA and the restrictions that they had on the things that he could make money off of and how he could promote himself. A lot of people today also believe that this law that is passed in California is going to have the greatest effect on young athletes, specifically those of color and that come from poor backgrounds, which is something that LeBron also talked about in his interview. So much like James, who came from a background very similar to that, he claims that this law is very personal to him. So to think if it's personal for LeBron James, I'm sure it's personal for a lot of other people as well. Another interesting case that I would like to bring up is the case of the Fab Five. A lot of people can kind of see the restrictive power of the NCAA in this specific case. So the Fab Five was a group of freshmen that Michigan had recruited in 1991, and it consisted of Chris Webber, Jalen Rose, Juwan Howard, Jimmy King, and Ray Jackson. And they actually led Michigan's to the 1992 and 1993 NCAA championships. They were very big and very popular in the sport of basketball, and a lot of people started following them as soon as they started to make the news that they were making. Sales increased dramatically in merchandise, and it actually went from $1.5 million per year in merchandise to almost $10 million a year when the Fab Five joined Michigan. Nike actually released a sneaker named after the group, and they became a national scandal when news of boosters paying to support the five players was actually leaked. So that's when the NCAA stepped in, and now we see this question arise. Well, was it fair for these players to have the University of Michigan profit off their name, image, and performance? According to the NCAA, the players agree to this when they commit to the NCAA member institutions. So this was just another kind of example of the NCAA having the restrictive power that it has with its legislation. So now that we've seen some different reasonings behind the harshness of the NCAA's rulings, let's go ahead and look at the other side of the coin for just a little bit. We have to acknowledge the reason that the NCAA even had this ruling in place to start with. So the NCAA states that they want to place a very high emphasis on the concept of a student athlete, meaning that they want a student's education to come first rather than athletics. They really believe that if athletics were to come first and that was all that was emphasized, the aspect of a student would be lost and they would then be considered a professional athlete. However, in a recent study by CBS Sports of 409 different Pac-12 student athletes, some very interesting facts were discovered. So the question that they wanted to figure out was, can student athletes actually receive the full benefits of education, of being a student athlete and putting that student first, due to their rigorous schedules? So 54% of student athletes said they don't have enough time to study for their tests. 80% of student athletes say that they missed at least one class for competition during that academic year. And it is estimated by the feedback given by these student athletes that they have to spend at least 50 hours a week on athletics. So this then arises the next question. If students don't have time for education, hasn't the concept of a student athlete then be diminished? And are they now just considered athletes, which is exactly what the NCAA did not want to do? So now that we've taken a look at some of the legislation within the NCAA and kind of looked at both sides of the coin with this, let's take a look at a couple of landmark cases that really kind of deal with the topic that we're talking about. So the first case is White versus the NCAA. So White and three other former student athletes claim that the NCAA violated antitrust laws because they were limiting grant and aid that they received for scholarships to tuition, books, housing, and meals, and this actually added up to be less than the cost of attendance. The NCAA settled, which is the settlement that we were talking about earlier in one of the cases, or one of the slides stating what the NCAA was using their money for every year. And schools are now permitted to purchase health insurance for athletes. They have multiple funds set up to provide various benefits to student athletes. and they actually have a $10 million fund that past athletes could receive cash payment or additional payment for further education because they weren't getting the cost of attendance. So what exactly does this case mean for our purposes? So student athletes now get the cost of attendance at their institutions. So this subsequently allows student athletes to be paid a little bit more than they were before for their efforts in the classroom as well as on the field and on the court. The next landmark case that we're going to look at is O'Bannon versus the NCAA, which has actually been occurring pretty recently in the news today. So Ed O'Bannon, he's pictured here on the left, was a former player for the UCLA men's basketball program. Very high-level player for them. And he actually recently filed suit against NCAA when EA Sports, which is the gaming system that typically comes out with all of the video games for NCAA and professional football games, was promoting various student athletes and their image. And Ed O'Bannon really felt that that's violating the Sherman Antitrust Act law, and it's just an antitrust violation altogether. The NCAA actually ruled, and I put it in quotes here, that even though the NCAA's amateurism rules are unlawful, the fact that colleges compensate student athletes with the cost of attendance, the NCAA frees itself from antitrust violations. So overall, this case has not 100% been decided, but the NCAA has initially ruled that, yes, well, the courts, have initially ruled that even though the NCAA is what they're doing is unlawful, since they're paying the cost of attendance, it pretty much frees itself from antitrust violations, which a lot of people truly believe is not the way it should work in collegiate sports. So some final thoughts. What does all of this necessarily mean for sports management? So sport managers, in our opinion, really must prepare for possible changes in the legislation of the NCAA. There have been a lot of people pushing recently to pay collegiate athletes what they deserve to be paid. And it's a pretty big deal, so it wouldn't surprise us if eventually in the future the NCAA is forced to make some changes to their legislation. Coaches and administrators have become very familiar with the wording of the NCAA legislation and bylaws, so they just have to be prepared and ready for a change at any point. California, they have to understand, may not be the only state adopting these new pay-to-play laws, and sport managers have to be aware that there may be a domino effect with these states. Sport managers must also know what the risks will be if the NCAA keeps their legislation. So this could mean that their institutions are going to get banned or fined for being a part of such laws, which kind of acknowledges the fears of USC and of Stanford. Finally, just to kind of sum it all up, we understand that California has become the most recent state to allow their collegiate athletes to be compensated for their name and likeness. The NCAA claims that student athletes should not be paid in order to keep the amateur status and to put their education first. But as we've acknowledged, is their education really coming first, though? Many court cases argue that the NCAA's restrictions on paying student athletes violates the Sherman Antitrust Act because concerns of a monopoly within the NCAA are incredibly rampant. And as we concluded in our last slide, sport managers should be aware of the recent passing of California's law that the governor recently passed, stating that it could mean the NCAA will make changes to their legislation, and what that could also mean as in fines or bans from the NCAA as a whole. So these are our resources that we used for our PowerPoint. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to the work that we did in regards to paying collegiate athletes, and we hope you learned a little bit more about the situation and what has been going on currently in the NCAA deciding if it is legal or not to do what they are doing.